E2 Tech's GRIDsilience event had 3 panels. This is the second on grid transformation with Versant Power's Dave Norman and Central Maine Power's Craig Nail. For slides and video, go to e2tech.org.
Hi, I'm Orion Breen, Executive Director of E2 Tech, the Environmental and Energy Technology Council of Maine. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm sure Dave will talk about what a modern day miracle the grid is, but thinking about building the grid of the future for more resilient and affordable energy. That's what we're here today. We'll have Dave Norman from Versant Power come up, talking about how can we transform the grid.
Thank you, Orion. Thank you. I appreciate being here. We're going to jump right into the presentation. First of all, I want to read this slide, so to speak. The most complicated machine ever built in the history of the world. A lot of you have probably already seen that, but I want you to think about what that means for a moment. I have 10 minutes to explain the most complicated machine in the history of the world. And since I will fail miserably doing that, instead we're going to do something a little bit different. And to use the unfortunate analogy of how to eat an elephant, it's 2 bites or 1 bite at a time. We're going to take 2 bites of that elephant and only 2 bites of that elephant. Going to do a little level setting here of where we are for the amount of distributed energy resources or solar that is connected to the distribution system here in Maine. We lead the nation, and it's not by a little bit, it's by a lot. This study came out about 2 weeks ago from the Institute of Self-Reliance. And effectively, we're at 1,376 watts per person for the state. That's double the nearest. We're double what Hawaii is. To give you some idea, as a percentage, Versant is the highest in Maine, and Maine is obviously, as you see, highest in the nation. And our percentage of solar connected to the distribution system as a percentage of our peak load is somewhere in the neighborhood of 107%. To give you some idea, of Vermont's about 55, Hawaii is about 55%, somewhere in that range. So we're more than double, again, what the next nearest states are. So again, 2 bites. We're going to talk about how the grid really works. And those of you who know me, I'm a physics guy, ultimately, and I'm always going to talk about physics. I'll wear that label proudly. And so first of all, we're going to talk about the interconnects and how the grid works, and then reactive power, which is something that we don't talk about. It's kind of hard to explain. It's also called imaginary power. And for anyone who wants to know why it's called imaginary power, I'm happy to talk to you afterward, but I'm not going to go into that because it goes into the square root of -1, and we don't need to do that. The grid in North America is split into 4 interconnections. Every single power plant, every single home within an area from Nova Scotia all the way down to Florida and well west of the Mississippi River is electrically connected together. It is synchronized. All the power plants come together. In order for a new power plant to come online, it has to come online at precisely the correct moment to synchronize to that grid, or it will destroy itself. And that has happened, where you take, say, a multi-$100-million piece of equipment, and it's basically reduced to major repairs within the fraction of a second if this process is done incorrectly. What this means, though, in the best example I can give is probably the chipper motor at the Skowhegan Sappi paper mill. When they go to hit the start button to start that motor, every single power plant within hundreds of miles contributes to get that running. They all go just a little bit as that large motor starts up. It depends on how close they are. The closer they are, the more they contribute. The more inertia they have, the more they contribute. A solar field is not going to really contribute at all to that, getting that motor running. But everyone contributes, so to speak, and you can see it from miles away. We're going to go into some of those details later. The key is everyone is connected in these areas. Now, Texas and Quebec, I'm going to irreverently call them the Kingdom of Texas and the Kingdom of Quebec, are on their own. And we've seen what can happen in that sense from the Texas February of 2022 challenges. They had a lot of outages during that cold snap and did not have enough capacity from the other connections. There's only 2 connections to the Eastern interconnection to help them out. And they obviously had major challenges. The key thing to know that the bigger the interconnection, the more reliable that interconnection will be. And so that's partly why the system has been set up this way, to have these massive interconnections. All right, very briefly, we're going to look at some curves. As we bring inverters onto the system, what happens is you have these square waves, and you can see that in yellow right there. They can't make perfect power. The perfect power is in the pure sine waves in the blue. But inverters can only make it in these square waves. Now, they can make really poor ones, which is even poorer than that. That's called a simple square wave. It just goes up and down and nothing else. And then you can make better inverters, which try to mimic that pure sine wave by having multiple steps. And they use sophisticated filters in the inverters to do that. And then they can get pretty close on how good the power quality is, but they're not perfect. And that's the key thing to understand from the physics conversation is it totally changes the grid when we have lots of inverter-based resources, IBRs, you'll hear me say that again, as opposed to pure sine waves that we get with large generators. So this is the GE Frame 7, and this is a ubiquitous turbine that power plants all around the nation and really all around the world are built with. We have 6 of these in the state of Maine, 1 in Rumford, 1 in Bucksport, 2 in Vesey, and 2 right here in Westbrook up the street. To give you some idea, that large turbine blade right here is about 6 or 7 feet in diameter, and this spins at 3,600 revolutions per minute. So you got something on the order of 7 tons of steel spinning at 3,600 RPM. That's a lot of inertia. It's inertia that we have under the normal legacy system. But during the day, when we have lots of solar come online and take over, these are shut down. And I'm going to talk about a little bit why that's a challenge. This is a larger one. This is actually at a nuclear power plant in England, and you can see that's about 16, 18 feet in diameter. This one spins at about 1,800 revolutions per minute, so quite a bit slower, but you can see the massive, many, many tons spinning at 30 revolutions per minute. A lot of inertia that goes away when we shut down this sorts of systems, and that's what's changing with the grid. So I'm going to jump into reactive power for a moment. Reactive power is effectively the energy we need to simply create the grid, to create the voltage and frequency in the grid. And the best way I can explain it is it creates the magnetic and electric fields that we use to, say, operate a motor. Every single kitchen refrigerator has a motor in it, which the first thing you have to do in that motor is create that magnetic field to get the rotor spinning in that motor. And so the reactive power is that energy necessary to create that magnetic field in the motor. The motor's not going to work unless we do that. And so the grid won't work as well. All the lines have to have a magnetic field in terms of the conductors that go on transmission lines. And you can't transmit power unless you create that magnetic field. So we have to have reactive power, but the higher that reactive power is, the more losses that are occurred within the grid. So we work very hard as utilities to lower it. But guess what? Everyone in this room has an impact on what the reactive power is. If we go out and buy cheap motors in our refrigerators, cheap motors to run a hot tub or a pool pump or something, you're increasing the reactive power necessary to get that motor running. If you go out and buy a good high quality one with good insulation in it, you lower the amount of reactive power that's needed to run the grid. So we all have an impact on that reactive power. And that's why that quality of the appliances that we purchase has a huge impact on the reactive power. Now, I talked about solar earlier, and ISO New England has put out this graph a few years ago, and we've all seen the duck curve. And we could talk about what happens and what's trying to happen as far as moving solar from noon to, say, 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night when we need it, but that's not what we're going to talk about. What I want you to pay attention closely to is as we have more and more solar, the steepness of these lines. The steeper those lines, that means more power plants are shutting down. More of those large inertia-based power plants, inertia-based generators are shutting down, and it gets harder to maintain quality, maintain stability and reliability of the grid because we have fewer of those large inertia-based generators running. Plus, in the afternoon when the sun is setting, now you have to start up that power plant. ISO New England is giving precise directions to power plants. I want you to be started up and running at precisely 600 megawatts at 4:10 p.m. And you over there, I want you to be precisely at 300 megawatts at 4:15 p.m. And if they miss, it gets harder and harder to maintain the grid. So that's one of the challenges that we have in terms of the reliability, making those switches every single day, every single morning and every single night as we shut down and start those power plants back up. You can see in Versant, this is our northern Maine territory, we have so much solar generation in Versant now in the MPD that we are, on a normal day, we supply all of the power for northern Maine from solar, and we have to export a good chunk of it, here about 25% of that power back into Canada because we don't have enough power, if you will. We don't have enough storage to store it for use later. There's no choice other than to send it back into Canada. So what we're trying to do to maintain stability is we have installed, along with ISO New England directed us, as we've done interconnection studies, for the northern Maine, for the grid here in Versant territory, we have installed 3 synchronous condensers and a STATCOM. A synchronous condenser is nothing but a large rotating motor that's synchronized to the grid, just like those other generators are. And what happens in that case, it's sitting there spinning in order to provide reactive power. Because as we shut down those large inertia-based generators, we lose reactive power capability of the grid, but we still have to have it because the grid, as I referred to earlier, has to have that reactive power. So the source has to come from somewhere. And so as a result, we have 27% of all the synchronous condensers, all of the state-of-the-art technology to maintain the grid just in this tiny little Versant Power territory in northern Maine. That's crazy. Just for a second, I want you to think about that. 27% of all this brand new state-of-the-art technology is in Versant? It's sort of a crazy number, but it's a result of we have so much inverter-based resources in our territory, and the stability in northern Maine is challenged because it can pull down the rest of the system. So in order to maintain that stability, ISO New England has directed us and some of the wind resources to install this equipment, as well as what's called a STATCOM. Now, one of the benefits of pump storage is going to be the fact that it is synchronous to the grid. So it can be a source of reactive power to maintain the grid, a source of inertia that the IBRs don't do as good a job on. So that's one of the benefits of pump storage versus a normal battery situation. All right, if you've never seen bears on bikes, here we go. The Rocky Lab, formerly NREL, put this out. And what's happened is you can see the legacy grids all the way to the left, Mama Bear on a single bike riding, everything's in control. And as you put more of the inverter-based resources on, now it's Mama Bear with Baby Bear on a trail behind, and you're still in good shape because Mama Bear is still the inertia riding down the road. You've got all that weight. But as you go the opposite, you get into 25% of those legacy assets. Now you've put Baby Bear on the front of the bike, and you can see Baby Bear is desperately trying to keep the bike steering. You can see that he's trying, but Mama Bear on the back, it's awful hard to keep things straight with so much of the inertia gone and so much of those grid following resources of the inverters on the back end. And eventually, if you go too far, we're on the ground. And so this is a great analogy that they put out explaining what happens to the grid over time as you increase the amount of inverter-based resources. But talk really briefly about Spain for last year. So a little over a year ago, they had their outage. The entire Iberian Peninsula went down. And what happened is, and we're going to see this, Parker's going to show this as well. In the half an hour prior to the actual event's right here, you can see how much it swung, and they can't handle that, and it went flat. At any rate, for about a 4-minute period and a 3.5-minute period in the half an hour preceding the outage, they had a significant oscillation take place, and they didn't know what was going on. In fact, they took some actions to try to make that go away, but it turned out they made that grid more fragile, not less fragile. But they didn't know it. If you look at those events, you can see what happened. This is the 4-minute and this is the 3.5-minute. And you can see the swinging that was going on within the system. And finally, if you look into the detail, and I want to give you some idea of why I brought up the initial synchronized and how the grid in North America, that Eastern Interconnect, includes that whole area. This was just prior to the event, and this gets into one of the big swings. The tight swings in here are effectively what was going on in Turkey, Latvia, Ukraine, Germany, and Poland. And Ukraine and Turkey are about 2,300 miles away from Madrid, to give you some idea, okay? So in other words, within a fraction of a second when they finally went, you could see that disturbance occur 2,300 miles away in the Ukraine and Turkey. So we're all connected together in North American grid. And that's one of the things I wanted to point out. And the impact of us in Versant Power, for instance, if we didn't have those synchronous condensers, could domino through the rest of the system. And so it's very important that everyone work together with ISO New England's, all the ISOs work together to maintain stability and direct utilities to do certain things. And as we switch to more IBR resources, this is a challenge that can occur. In the Spain case, it was a 250 megawatt solar facility that was ultimately the cause of the oscillations. So inverter-based generation in Spain. And they didn't have enough of the resources, for instance, those synchronous condensers I was talking about, to maintain control of the voltage, maintain control of the reactive power. And they went down in a heap in about 30 seconds. To give you some idea, the 2003 outage that occurred in the Northeast, that took about 30 minutes on the low end. It was actually about 3 hours in occurring. But the last really bad event took still 30 minutes before they were down flat. This was 30 seconds. So, which is an extremely fast period of time to collapse a grid. And so they had very little time to make adjustments and fix it. I'm done. I just 2 bites of that elephant.
Thank you, Dave. You can see why we invited Dave. We'll invite Craig Nail from CMP to share their perspective.
This is going to be a bit different from Dave's very physics-based approach here, but I think it's a really good segue into sort of what the challenges that the utilities faced in executing the integrated grid plan and the climate change protection plan. So I thought I would just give a perspective from CMP's implementation of those two requirements. Like Chairman Bartlett said, this was passed by the legislature in 2022. The first initiative was the climate change protection plan. This is an 18-month process that was informed by over a year of stakeholder engagement at the commission and everybody giving their input into what priorities those grid plans should focus on. So when the order came out in 2024, it started that formal 18-month planning process. And what the order included was sort of two parallel frameworks. So one was, how should the utilities approach that 18-month process in a structured way? And there were 3 milestone events during that 18 months. So the first was developing the models and making sure that we were sharing the inputs to those models and how those models will be applied. The second was identifying needs on the system. So when we have the model and we apply it to the current system, where are the needs going to emerge? And then the third milestone was solutions development. So we've established a model that people generally agree on. We've established what the needs are going to be on the system over a 10-year period. And the final piece here was to identify potential solutions. Taking a step back, just with that kind of in the back of your mind, I don't know about Versant's, the size of your service area, but for CMP, it's about twice the size of the state of Connecticut. We've got 25,000 miles of lines. Just looking out the window here, you can see power lines running along the street. Since I've started working at CMP a few years ago, I am always amazed. Wherever I go, there's a power line, there are utility poles. It's an incredible amount of space to cover, of infrastructure. We're the most heavily forested state in the country, so that's an additional challenge. Over 60% of outages are caused by tree contact. So it's just an incredible amount of stuff to maintain and to upgrade and to make sure is functioning properly. I think we take for granted just how often when you flip the switch, the lights actually do come on, and it's an incredible challenge. So doing that level of analysis for the modeling, the needs assessment, and the solutions development is an incredible amount of work. And just to compare it to a formal sort of cost recovery proceeding like a CPCN or a rate case, those types of proceedings involve a lot more very detailed analysis of a very specific part of the system. So the challenge for us was to produce a outcome, a grid plan that was valuable, that had some use, that was informative, that allowed people to better understand the planning process and the potential needs over a 10-year period. But with this 18-month planning process and such an incredibly large system, it's very, very difficult to get into the level of detail that we normally would for a regular, actual cost recovery project proposal that we would put in front of the commission. So that's one of the main challenges, I think, for the IGP in general. At the same time that we were doing those 3 formal milestones, and those were based around, Melissa mentioned this forecast, the SELT forecast from the ISO New England. So we were given a forecast to use that includes flexibility, it includes energy efficiency, it includes projections around the number of DERs that would be on the system, load growth over that 10-year period. So as we were using that forecast and applying it to the system in those 3 milestones, we were also asked to consider 3 priorities that were developed during the formation of the commission's order. And those priorities were, one, probably most obviously, reliability and resilience. How do we make sure that the lights come on? How do we make sure that the system can recover after storm events? How do we make sure that the system can withstand sort of the new challenges that Dave is describing and the additional load that we're expecting over a 10-year period? So pretty straightforward there. The second one was data quality and integrity. So this is all about sort of how are we gathering data about what's happening on the system? What devices are necessary? What are we doing with that data once we have it? What's the value of that data? How do we ensure that that data is quality and can be used by the utility and potentially third parties? And then the last one is flexible management of consumers' load. So a number of speakers today have talked about the importance of flexibility as we go forward. There's an AI data center developer in the room who's talking about flexibility for Bitcoin mining, and that's very interesting. Everyone is talking about the need for flexibility. If we just are building the grid around those very short peaks, then we'll be in a tough spot. So for us, what we looked at here is some of the technology that's available. Once we have that data, are we able to manage it? Are we able to store it? Are we able to use it? It's going to be an incredible amount of data once we are able to get it on small intervals for the entire system. So just even the data management component of it for us is going to be a challenge. But then once we have that data, what are we doing with it? We're going to be integrating it into our planning models, and we'll be looking to use technologies like active network management, ADMS, DERMS, ways that we can understand what's happening on the grid, so that when we approach a condition out there that is going to cause a potential outage, a potential violation, a potential thermal or voltage violation, we can adjust the grid to make sure that we're operating within a level of security that will make sure that power is reliable for all the resources that are interconnecting. At the same time, so I think Chairman Bartlett also mentioned the Climate Change Protection Plan. We undertook this component of it. So the grid plan was largely focused on capacity growth, load growth. The Climate Change Protection Plan was more of the side of things that's focused on reliability and storm and blue sky conditions too, but mostly with storm. CMP undertook a 2-year planning process here. The first phase was to look at the climate science. So what are the conditions that we're expecting in our service territory? And heat, storms, flooding were probably the 3 major drivers here. And then the second component of it was knowing what we can expect, or knowing what we should expect in terms of climate change. What are the ways that we can address that in a way that's cost effective? And actually, if you look out the window here, there's a 3-phase line running along the street, and there's a fiberglass cross arm. It's gray, it's not wood. And that sounds pretty mundane, but it's actually a much stronger material. Think about when a tree falls on that line. If that cross arm breaks, you're going to have the lines fall. You're going to have to replace that cross arm. It's a very simple way to add a little bit of strength to the system. And so as we're out replacing assets that are aging, that's a great way to do a very simple, cost-effective improvement that has a real reliability benefit. Also, interestingly, I didn't really realize this until our study, but with the warmer temperatures, warmer winters, warmer summers, we're also seeing a lot more pests on the system. So these wooden poles, wooden cross arms are susceptible to just getting eaten by pests. And so these are a good way to address that too. I normally have a slide, and I didn't bring them today, but there's one that I really like that shows, it's a scatter plot of all of the different conditions that we experience on the system. So think about a day like today, actually, where this afternoon, imagine the sun is out a little bit more than it will be today, but it's a pretty mild day. If you have heat pumps, they're probably not on today. If you have electric heat, it's probably not on today. 2 in the afternoon, you're not home, you're at work. Nobody's really cooking. There's very little use of electricity at 2 in the afternoon. But if it were sunny out and we were in a rural part of the state, we'd have a lot of solar putting power onto the system. So that's one condition where you've got a lot of generation on the system and very low usage of the system. Compare that to, say, like a winter evening in southern York County. You've got everyone coming home from work. You might be doing laundry and cooking, and your heat pump is cranking. The sun is down, so there's no solar producing power for the system. That's the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So we've got a lot of high usage of the system and very low generation to support that usage. So those are 2 opposite ends of the spectrum. And what we saw in the grid plan was that both of these situations can produce concerning conditions on the system or violations for our equipment. In the first one, where we've got a lot of generation and not a lot of usage, we're seeing reverse power flow that is causing the power to flow in the direction that it was maybe not designed for originally. And that is a stressor on assets. And then the opposite condition, where we have a lot of usage of the system and very low generation, we're seeing violations on the system during that peak hour, because the system is being just used so heavily. It's illustrative of the the different challenges that the utilities are facing, and it just completely depends on time of year, on time of day. And I think that was a lot of the value of the grid plan, was to highlight like what are these ranges of challenges, and what are the potential ways to address them. So we're looking at, like I said, the active network management technologies, ADMS terms, some of the ways that we can control the system from the central control center at CMP. But other technologies that are on the table, I think, are battery storage, a way to sort of suck up some of that generation and deploy it later in the day when it's needed. And the other one that is interesting is from the planning perspective, and once we are able to collect the data and use it, integrate it into our planning models, it's called time series planning. And the commission asked us specifically to address this in our grid plans. But it's the concept of, instead of knowing that the system is going to hit a certain peak at one point during the year and planning around that peak, are we able to identify when that peak is going to occur and how long that peak is going to occur for, so that we can plan around just the peak? And I don't want to oversell it, because I think that the system needs to operate within safe limits. We don't want to build just exactly to the peak, because if something changes, that will cause an outage. But the more we know about when those peaks are occurring and how long they're occurring, we could potentially implement a solution like a battery, or even a mobile battery, to bring that battery to the location that it's needed for the time that it's needed, to be able to solve that very limited issue that we're seeing on the system. So, kind of exciting thing to look forward to. We're not there yet, but it is a priority of ours, and I know the commission. So something to keep watching for as we keep doing the next grid plan, which is going to start in November of next year.
Thank you, Craig. We'll take 1 minute for quick questions, and we'll get more later. We're zooming through this. This is an overview, trying to get multiple perspectives of how do we update the grid and make it resilient. And we'll dive into these topics deeper in the future as well.
I was in communication or discussions with someone from South Australia, and they're almost at 100% solar at this point in time, certainly on certain days. And I said, how were you doing it? And he said they use grid forming inverters that use synchronous digital or digital synchronous inverters. Have you looked at that and as a solution for you?
Completely agree that grid forming inverters, and if we went back to that slide that NREL put out, that was part of what they were talking about, was grid following versus grid forming inverters. There's a definitive difference, as you said. The vast majority of inverters that have been installed in Maine are grid following, not grid forming. And we don't have the ability to force them to use grid forming. But in the long run, we're going to have to do something like that as a state policy-wise, to say, look, if we want to continue on this road, we're either going to have grid forming inverters be required, or a combination of more what are called dynamic voltage control tools, dynamic reactive power controls, such as the synchronous condensers. We have to do both, or probably both of those things, but we have to carefully decide how much of each we do in order to maintain control of the grid.
And continuing the theme of incentivizing other solutions. So if you look at other places with high solar penetration like California, this is about the duck curve ramp up period. They've also effectively put a cost on that steep ramp up with the change in their net metering rules, to the point that now it doesn't make sense to buy just a solar system out in California, but you also need to get a battery system. And so you talked about how Versant's basically adding additional spinning mass to stabilize those, but especially with the drop in battery costs, where does incentivizing battery systems play in all of this?
Combined battery solar storage systems is going to be part of the solution. There's no question. The challenge is that we have to, the orchestra needs a conductor, is how I'm going to describe it. So the conductor has to be certain that the orchestra is going to play the string section when the orchestra needs the string section to play. And so we have to be certain that that battery is going to act appropriately is going to provide charging when it's supposed to be charging, discharging when it's supposed to be discharging, has the capacity within the battery. In other words, you've discharged overnight, and now it can charge at the noon periods of the day to make sure that it can pull the voltage down. That's the only way it's going to work. So it's going to be part of the solution going forward. We're going to have to figure out a way to do that in the long run, and they're going to have to take instructions from ISO New England and the distribution operators, Versant is one, in order to make sure that they work appropriately to maintain control of the grid.
I really want to thank all our panelists and the Rue Institute for hosting us, Central Maine Power, Chinbro, Drummond Wood, some amazing sponsors here. Thank you so much. We couldn't do it without you. E2 Tech programs are supported by our members and sustaining partners like the Maine Technology Institute, which offers grants, loans, equity investments, and services to foster Maine's innovation economy. Find out more about MTI at mainetechnology.org and about upcoming programs at e2tech.org, your main source for innovation information.